There was a smell that lived in the hallway of every walk-up in Spanish Harlem during the 1960s. It came from a pot that never fully cooled. Rice, beans, whatever protein could be stretched across 6 plates on a budget that would break your heart. The women who cooked in those kitchens did not follow recipes. They followed math. Number 20 on this list kept an entire generation alive through winters when the landlord cut the heat. Number 9 was something children made fun of at school until they grew up and realized it was genius. And number 14 was the one dish every Puerto Rican grandmother refused to let anyone else touch. These were not charity meals. They were engineering. Hit that subscribe button, because here are 25 forgotten poor man's meals Puerto Rican families ate to survive. Let us count them down. Number 25. Funch. Cornmeal mush cooked in nothing but water and salt, stirred with a wooden spoon until it pulled away from the sides of the pot in one heavy mass. In the mountains of Jayuya and Utuado during the 1940s, this was breakfast, lunch, and dinner in the same bowl. You ate it plain when the cupboard was bare. You ate it with cane syrup when payday came around. The texture was dense and warm, and it sat in your stomach like a promise that tomorrow would come. Families in the South Bronx carried funche with them through the Great Migration of the 50s, cooking it on shared hot plates in studio apartments because the building stove served 3 families at once. It cost almost nothing. It filled every empty space inside you, and that was all it needed to do. Number 24. Sopa de plátano verde. Green plantain soup. You peeled them while they were hard as a block of wood, grated them on a box grater until your knuckles bled, and dropped the starchy shreds into a broth made from whatever bones the butcher was throwing away that afternoon. In Bayamon and Caguas, this was the soup you made when the pantry held nothing else. The raw starch thickened the liquid into something that felt rich, even though it cost next to nothing. A smashed garlic clove, a single bouillon cube, a bay leaf floating on the surface. Children slurped it from ceramic cups because there were not enough bowls to go around. That soup taught a generation you did not need meat to feel full. You needed patience and a sharp grater and a mother who refused to let anyone go to bed hungry. Number 23. Arroz con salchichas. Rice with Vienna sausages from a can. This bridged the old country and the bodega economy of 1970s Brooklyn. You could not afford pork chops. You could not afford chicken thighs. But you could afford a small can of salchichas and stretch those little sausages across an entire pot of rice with enough sofrito and tomato sauce to make it taste like something your mother planned on purpose. Every kid who grew up on Myrtle Avenue in Bushwick remembers the metallic pop of that can lid. It was not gourmet food. It was not anything you would tell people about outside the family. It was Tuesday night in a kitchen where the groceries had to last until Friday, and it kept every person at that table fed and standing until Wednesday morning came around. Number 22. Gandinga. Organ stew made from the heart, liver, and kidneys of a pig, chopped fine and braised in thick tomato and pepper sauce until the iron smell disappeared entirely. This was the meal that told you exactly how tight money was that week. Nobody bought organ meat because they craved it. They bought it because it was the cheapest thing behind the counter at the carniceria on East 116th Street. But the women who cooked gandinga transformed those offcuts. They braised them low with recayito and cumin and a bay leaf until what remained was tender enough to cut with the side of a fork. You ate it over white rice and you did not complain, because complaining meant you did not understand what it cost to put that plate in front of you. Number 21. Serenata de bacalao. Salt cod salad served cold with boiled root vegetables, sliced avocado, raw onion rings, olive oil, and vinegar. This was Friday in Catholic Puerto Rico, when meat was forbidden and dried fish was the only protein most families could keep. Bacalao lasted forever without refrigeration. You soaked it overnight, boiled it the next morning, shredded it by hand, and tossed it with whatever roots you had dug that week. In Ponce and Mayagüez, families ate serenata every single Friday for years without variation. It was not boring to them. It was sacred in its repetition, a weekly ritual that anchored the calendar the way church anchored Sundays. The rhythm of that Friday meal was the rhythm of survival itself, unchanging, week after week, year after year, until the children grew up and moved to the mainland and realized they could not find bacalao anywhere that tasted the way their mother made it. Number 20. Sopón de garbanzos con patas de cerdo, chickpea soup with pig feet. This fed a family for 3 days on less than $1 of ingredients. The pig feet were nearly free because nobody in the American supermarket wanted them. They sat marked down in the cold case until a Puerto Rican woman carried them home, knowing what the rest of the neighborhood did not. Those feet, simmered for hours on a low flame, released collagen that turned watery broth into something that coated your mouth and warmed your chest from the inside. You added dried chickpeas because they were cheap and swelled to triple their size in the pot. You added calabaza pumpkin because it grew in window boxes on South Bronx fire escapes. You threw in a handful of broken fideos that stretched volume without stretching cost. The whole pot simmered through the morning on a back burner. By noon, the apartment smelled like a place you wanted to stay forever. By evening, every neighbor on the floor knew what was cooking because the steam carried under the doors and through the vents. The bones fell apart between your fingers. The marrow dissolved into golden broth. Children fought over the soft cartilage at the joints because it had a chewiness that felt like candy to a kid who never got actual candy. In Bayamon, this was a Sunday tradition that brought the entire extended family to one table. In the South Bronx, it was a Wednesday necessity that kept warmth inside a child who had nothing else to hold on to that week. The women who made it never measured a single ingredient. They knew the proportions by feel, by smell, by the color of the broth when it caught the light from the kitchen window. And they knew something else too. They knew that a pig foot nobody in the supermarket wanted could become the absolute center of a meal nobody in the family would ever forget for the rest of their lives. Number 19. Guanames. Cornmeal dumplings wrapped in banana leaves and boiled until firm and dense. The masa was nothing complicated. Cornmeal, coconut milk if you had it, a pinch of sugar, salt. You shaped them into cylinders with wet hands, tied the leaf ends with string, and dropped them into boiling water. In Louisa and Carolina, they served guanames alongside braised salt cod or just plain with butter melting across the surface. They were filling, cheap, and completely portable. Field workers carried them wrapped in cloth for the midday break. Children pulled them apart after school with sticky fingers. The faint, grassy, vegetal flavor the banana leaf gave the cornmeal was something no aluminum foil or wax paper could ever replicate. You had to use the leaf, that was the whole point. The wrapping was not packaging, the wrapping was an ingredient. Number 18. Harina de maíz con leche. Cornmeal porridge cooked in milk with a stick of cinnamon and enough sugar to quiet a hungry child. The breakfast of last resort and the dinner of no choice. When the rice ran out and the bread was gone, you reached for the cornmeal and the last cup of milk in the icebox. You stirred it over the lowest flame until it thickened into something between oatmeal and pudding, smooth and warm and sweet enough to make a child fall asleep. In Humacao and Fajardo, mothers made this 3 or 4 mornings a week during the worst stretches. It was never written in any cookbook. It was a reflex that lived in the wrist and the wooden spoon, passed from one tired mother to the next without a single word of instruction. Number 17. Hueyes hervidos. Boiled land crabs caught by hand in the mangroves after dark. Before the 1980s, the coastal towns of Luquillo and Piñones were full of families who ate crab not as luxury, but because it was entirely free. You went out at night with a burlap sack and a flashlight. You caught them from the muddy roots and carried them home alive. You boiled them in salted water with crushed garlic and ate them with your hands on newspaper spread across the kitchen table. No drawn butter, no lemon wedge, just sweet white meat and the quiet satisfaction of having caught your own dinner with nothing but your hands and a sack. That was a kind of wealth no paycheck could ever give you. There is a difference between being poor and eating poorly. The families who cooked these meals understood that distinction somewhere deeper than words could reach. Poverty was a number on a paycheck. Poverty was a landlord knocking on the door. But the food was something else entirely. The food was defiance. a daily refusal to let economics dictate the dignity of a dinner table. Every single dish on this list was born from a moment when someone looked at what they had left, which was almost nothing, and decided it would be enough. That decision, repeated thousands of times in thousands of kitchens, is the reason these recipes exist at all. Number 16. Revoltillo de huevos. Scrambled eggs, cooked in a base of sofrito with diced ham or whatever leftover protein sat in the back of the refrigerator. Not diner scrambled eggs, pale and bland on a white plate. These were eggs transformed by the core of Puerto Rican cooking. Onion, pepper, garlic, tomato sauce, all fried in oil until the kitchen smelled like Saturday morning in Santurce. You cracked eggs directly into that fragrant pan and stirred until everything married into something soft and savory and deeply colored. You ate it with bread or scooped up with the last piece of pan de agua from yesterday. It cost pennies. It took 5 minutes from flame to plate. And it tasted like someone in that kitchen loved you enough to make nothing feel like something real. Number 15. Carne beef. Canned corned beef fried with onions and tomato sauce, served over white rice. The can was square, and you opened it with a key that wound the metal strip around itself. Every Puerto Rican child of the 1960s and 70s remembers that key in their mother's hand. Carne beef was the emergency protein living in the back of the pantry for months, waiting for the day when nothing else remained. Then it appeared in a cast-iron skillet, sizzling and salty, filling the apartment with a metallic, savory smell that meant things were tight this week, but nobody under this roof was going hungry tonight. You ate it without question. You ate it with the kind of gratitude only an empty stomach teaches. Number 14. Sopa de gandules con bolitas de plátano, pigeon pea soup with green plantain dumplings, a pot of dried gandules soaked overnight, simmered with sofrito, a ham bone if one could be found, and small balls of grated green plantain dropped in at the end to thicken the broth into something that stuck to your ribs and kept you full through a 12-hour shift. In Louisa and Carolina during the 1950s, this was what you made when the rice was running low and payday was still 3 days away. The gandules gave protein, the ham bone gave depth from almost nothing, and the bolitas, pinched from a single green plantain grated into a bowl with a little salt, swelled in the hot liquid until each one was dense and starchy and filling enough to replace the rice entirely. You dropped them in one at a time, watching each sink and then slowly rise as it cooked through. The whole pot cost less than 30 cents to make if you already had the bone saved from Sunday. Women in public housing in Puerto de Tierra kept bags of dried gandules in the cabinet the way other households kept emergency cash. When everything else ran out, that bag was still there, and the soup it made was not thin or watery or sad. It was thick, dark gold, fragrant with recao and ají dulce, and it filled a family of 6 from a single pot on the stove. Nobody called it a poor man's meal at the table. They called it sopa de mamá, and they asked for seconds before the steam had even stopped rising from the first bowl. Number 13. Sopa de salchichón, salami soup. You took a chunk of hard, dry salami from behind the bodega counter and simmered it with cubed potatoes, sliced carrots, and broken noodles until the fat rendered out and turned the broth a savory pink. Nobody outside the community would call this a real soup. But inside those kitchens, it was medicine. You ate it when you were sick and the cold came through the walls in January. The salt from the salami seasoned everything it touched without needing a single thing added. One chunk of cheap salami fed a whole pot that lasted 2 full days. The children who grew up on sopa de salchichón still crave it when winter arrives, not because it was sophisticated, but because it was warm and salty, and it meant someone was taking care of them when everything else felt cold. Number 12. Arroz mamposteado, day-old rice refried with leftover beans and whatever else remained from the night before. The name means messy, mixed up, thrown together without ceremony. You heated oil in a heavy caldero, dumped in yesterday's rice and yesterday's beans, and stirred over high heat until the flavors merged and the bottom got dark and crispy. In Caguas and Arecibo, this was Monday morning built entirely from Sunday leftovers. It wasted nothing. It tasted better than the original because the flavors had married overnight in the refrigerator. And the pegao, the crispy layer stuck to the bottom of the pot, was the prize everyone at the table fought over with their spoons. Number 11. Pionono. Ripe plantains sliced lengthwise, fried flat, rolled into a cylinder around seasoned ground meat, sealed with egg wash, and fried again until golden. The plantain had to be perfectly ripe, black-skinned and soft enough to bend without cracking, sweet enough to caramelize on contact with hot oil. You fried the slices just enough to soften them, let them cool on paper, then rolled each one around a spoonful of picadillo seasoned with sazon and a handful of olives. The seam got pinned shut with a toothpick or sealed with beaten egg. Patient, fiddly work that nobody rushed. In Aguadilla and Mayaguez during the 1960s, mothers made trays of piononos on Sunday afternoons and stored them in the icebox for school lunches through the week. The sweet plantain shell disguised the meat and vegetables so completely that children who refused stewed beef at dinner ate piononos without a single complaint. A whole tray cost less than $1 in plantains and stretched a quarter-pound of ground meat into 8 portions. The trick was knowing exactly how ripe the plantain needed to be. One day too green and it cracked when you rolled it. One day too far and it fell apart in the oil. The women who made piononos every week never checked the skin. They pressed a thumb into the flesh and knew by feel alone whether it would hold. That knowledge did not come from a cookbook. It came from years of standing at that stove, rolling and frying until your hands remembered what your eyes could not measure. Number 10. Batata hervida con aceite y sal. Boiled sweet potato with oil and coarse salt. Nothing else beside it. This was the meal beneath all other meals on this list. When the rice was gone and the beans were gone and there was no money coming until Friday, there was still a sweet potato in the bin. You boiled it whole in its skin, split it open, drizzled oil across the steaming orange flesh, hit it with salt, and ate it with your hands over the sink. In Ajuntas and Lares, the mountain towns where cash was rarest, this was dinner more nights than anyone wanted to admit out loud. It was not a side dish. It was the whole plate. And somehow it was always enough. Nobody photographed these meals. Nobody wrote them into cookbooks until decades later when the women who invented them were already gone. These recipes existed only in motion, passed hand to hand, mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor across fire escapes and through shared hallways. The knowledge was physical, not intellectual. You knew how thick the funchi should be because your wrist had stirred it 1,000 times. You knew the plantain was ready because your thumb told you. That kind of knowledge does not survive on a printed page. It survives only in kitchens that are still occupied, and when those kitchens empty out, it disappears from the world without a sound. Number 9. Arañitas de plátano verde, little spiders, green plantain shredded on a box grater and fried in small, tangled clumps until the edges went crispy and the center stayed soft and starchy. The name came from their shape in the oil, shreds splaying outward like legs in every direction. In public schools in San Juan and Bayamon during the 1960s, children who brought arañitas wrapped in brown paper got laughed at by classmates whose parents could afford the packaged snacks from the colmado. The smell of reheated plantain grease on wax paper was unmistakable, and other children knew exactly what it meant. You were the kid whose family still fried everything at home because there was no money for anything sealed in plastic. That mockery lasted through elementary school, sometimes longer. But the strange thing was this. Every single one of those children grew up and wanted arañitas again. They wanted the crunch, the salt, the slightly bitter edge of green plantain hitting hot oil at exactly the right moment. Their mothers had known the timing by ear. Too early from the oil, and they stayed soggy. Too late, and they burned hard. The women who fried arañitas every afternoon listened to the pitch of the sizzle and pulled them at the precise second the sound changed from a hiss to a crackle. No timer, no thermometer, just decades of practice encoded in their hands. You shredded the green plantain into salted water to stop browning, drained the shreds, pressed small handfuls flat between your palms, and dropped each clump into shimmering oil. 30 seconds per side. Coarse salt went on while the surface still glistened hot enough to grab each crystal. Those same children who got mocked in school now spend their adult years trying to recreate that exact crunch in their own kitchens, and most of them cannot get it right because they never stood next to their mother long enough to learn what the oil was supposed to sound like. Number 8. Boudin de pain. Bread pudding made from stale bread soaked in beaten eggs, condensed milk, vanilla, and cinnamon. You did not throw away bread in a Puerto Rican household. You saved every dried end and forgotten slice in a paper bag on top of the refrigerator until you had enough to fill a baking pan. Then you soaked them until the bread dissolved, poured in the custard mixture, and baked it in a slow oven until the top caramelized golden and the kitchen smelled like a panaderia on a Sunday morning. In Ponce and Guayama, this was the Sunday dessert that cost almost nothing, but made the family feel like they were celebrating something real. Number 7. Majarete. Fresh corn pudding made from ground corn kernels cooked in their own milk, sweetened with sugar and set with cornstarch until the mixture firmed into a custard you could cut with a spoon. You sprinkled cinnamon across the top in lines and served it cold from the icebox. In the mountain towns of Coamo and Villalba, Majarete appeared at every family gathering because corn grew in the backyard and sugar was the cheapest thing on the island. No oven needed, no special equipment, just a heavy pot and the patience to stand stirring until your arm ached. It was the dessert of people who could not afford dessert but refused to live without sweetness. Number 6. Arroz con dulce. Sweet coconut rice pudding with raisins, fresh ginger, cloves, and cinnamon sticks. The Christmas dessert of every poor Puerto Rican household, non-negotiable even when money was at its worst and gifts were not happening. You cracked a dry coconut on the concrete steps, grated the white flesh by hand, and squeezed the shavings through cheesecloth with your bare fists until thick milk poured into the bowl below. The process took half a day. The result sat cooling in a glass dish covered with wax paper, ready for anyone who walked through that front door. It was not just food. It was proof that Christmas was real this year, even when nothing else about December felt worth celebrating. Number 5. Sopa de pollo con fideos. Chicken soup from a whole bird. Not delicate French broth. This was thick, golden, heavily seasoned soup built from the cheapest chicken at the market, boiled until the meat fell from bone, then loaded with fideos, cubed potatoes, corn rounds, and enough sazon to turn the broth sunset orange. In Humacao and Naguabo, this was the meal you made when someone was sick, when someone was heartbroken, when someone just arrived from the mainland with nothing in their pocket. It fixed what pharmacy pills could not fix. It fixed what words could not reach. The steam alone opened your sinuses before the first spoonful even touched your lips. And the women who made it believed in it the way a doctor believes in medicine, except their medicine came from a stock pot and cost less than a visit to the corner pharmacy. Number 4. Amarillos con queso blanco, fried sweet plantains with a thick slab of fresh white cheese. That was the whole meal. 2 ingredients on a plate. The plantain had to be nearly black, so loaded with sugar it caramelized on contact with oil. The cheese was firm and fresh, squeaking against your teeth when you bit down, balancing the sweetness with clean, sharp salt. In Aguada and Rincon, families ate this for dinner 2 or 3 nights a week during the hardest years. It required no skill beyond knowing when to flip a plantain. It required no money beyond a single trip to the colmado on the corner. And it satisfied something deeper than hunger. It satisfied the need to eat something at the end of a long day that tasted unmistakably like home. Number 3. Bacalao guisado. Salt cod braised in thick tomato sauce with potatoes, olives, and capers. Different from the cold serenata higher on this list. This was the hot version, the winter version, eaten over a mountain of white rice when the temperature dropped and the concrete walls held no warmth. Bacalao was cheap because it lasted months on the shelf without refrigeration. You soaked it overnight, shredded the flesh by hand, and braised it until each piece absorbed the sauce and turned tender and savory. In East Harlem during the 1960s, this was Friday dinner in apartment after apartment, floor after floor, the same smell drifting through every vent and stairwell, until the whole block smelled like one enormous shared kitchen. Number 2. Tortilla de amarillos. Sweet plantain omelet. You mashed leftover fried ripe plantains with a fork, mixed the sweet paste with beaten eggs and a pinch of salt, then poured it into a hot oiled skillet and cooked it like a Spanish tortilla, flipping it with a plate until both sides set golden. It was breakfast, dinner, and packed lunch all in one. In Calle and Barranquitas, this was the dish that used up every overripe plantain that would otherwise rot on the counter. Nothing wasted. Nothing thrown away. The sweetness of the caramelized plantain and the richness of the egg together created something that tasted deliberate, not desperate. That quiet transformation, turning leftovers into something that tasted intentional, was the genius of every woman who ever stood at that stove. Number 1. Arroz blanco con mantequilla y huevo frito. White rice with butter and a fried egg. The most basic meal on this entire list and the most powerful. This sat at the absolute bottom of the ladder. When there was no meat, no beans, no plantain, no canned anything on the shelf, there was still rice in the bag and an egg in the carton and butter in the refrigerator door. You cooked the rice. You fried the egg until the edges went lacy and brown. You placed it on top and pushed the butter underneath where it melted into the hot grains and disappeared. You ate it in silence, not because you were sad, because it was enough. It was always enough. That is what every meal on this list has in common. Not ingredients, not technique. The understanding that enough is not failure. Enough is a grace that only poverty teaches. Once you learn it, you carry it forever. If you grew up eating any of these meals, you already know what they mean. They are not nostalgia. They are not history in a book. They are alive right now in every kitchen where someone stretches what they have into something that feeds more people than it should. Leave a comment and tell me which one your family still makes today. And if you have not already, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one.